The scream tore through the storm like a blade through canvas. High-pitched, desperate, and drowning, fast. Greyhawk's head snapped up from the horse tracks he'd been following. Through the driving rain and howling wind, he glimpsed a flash of pale fabric thrashing in the swollen Powder River. The current was merciless, a brown torrent thick with debris, rolling logs, and the bloated carcasses of cattle swept down from upstream ranches. A child, in the water, dying. Behind him, his horse whinnied and shied from the thunder. Ahead, through the sheets of rain, two dark figures scrambled up the muddy bank and melted into the cottonwoods. They moved like men fleeing a crime. The girl's head went under, came up gasping, went under again. Greyhawk's mind flashed to another river, another child, another storm. 8 years passed. His daughter Moonbear's face pale beneath the water, her small hands reaching for him, as the soldier's bullets found their mark and his world ended. Not again. He vaulted from his horse and hit the freezing water in a full sprint. The current slammed into him like a charging buffalo, but his powerful strokes cut through the chaos. 44 years of hunting, fighting, and surviving had carved his body into something that could endure what would kill most men. The girl surfaced 20 yards downstream, her mouth open in a silent scream of terror. A massive cottonwood branch spun toward her head like a club. Greyhawk dove deep, his lungs burning, and caught her ankle just as the branch whistled past. He hauled her up, her blue lips gasping for air, her pale fingers clawing at his shirt. She was small, maybe 10 years old, with honey-colored hair plastered to her skull and eyes the color of winter sky. Blood trickled from a gash on her forehead. The dialogue began in choked whispers. "Please, they pushed me. They said I'd tell." "You're safe now," Greyhawk said, fighting the current toward shore. "Who pushed you?" Her eyes rolled white with shock. Can't say. They'll kill Sarah, too." A rifle crack split the air. The bullet zipped past Greyhawk's ear and splashed into the water behind them. On the bank, a tall man in a black coat stood with a smoking Winchester. Even through the rain, Greyhawk recognized the cruel features of Blake Hargrove, the man who owned half of Crow's Ridge and the souls of most everyone in it. "Now that's far enough, Chief," Hargrove shouted, his voice carrying over the storm. "Drop the girl and swim away, or I'll put the next shot through your skull." Greyhawk's blood turned to ice water. The child in his arms wasn't drowning by accident. She'd been thrown to the river to die, and now they meant to finish the job. 3 more men emerged from the trees, rifles raised. Greyhawk recognized them. Bradley Morrison, Hargrove's foreman, with his permanent sneer and quick gun hand. Tom Briggs, the saloon owner who owed Hargrove more money than he'd see in 10 lifetimes. And Jack Corwin, the town drunk who'd do murder for a bottle of whiskey. "Just business, Chief." Morrison called out, water streaming from his hat brim. "Nothing personal. Girl's got a loose tongue, and loose tongues get people killed around here." The child, Annabelle. He suddenly remembered her name, trembled against his chest. "The watch." She whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "I still have the watch." Whatever that meant, it terrified her more than drowning. Greyhawk looked at the rifles pointed at them, and then at the roiling water, and then at the little girl whose trust in him was absolute. In her face, he saw Moonbear again. The same desperate hope, the same faith that her father could save her from the darkness closing in. This time would be different. "Hold your breath," he whispered to Annabelle. As the rifles erupted in fire and smoke, Greyhawk dove deep into the Powder River's muddy embrace, carrying the girl toward whatever salvation he could find on the far bank. The storm had been building for 3 days, turning Crow's Ridge into a quagmire of mud misery and mounting tension. The Wyoming Territory settlement sat in a natural bowl between 2 ridges, which made it defensible against hostiles, but turned it into a death trap when the Powder River overflowed its banks. Greyhawk had been tracking stolen horses from his tribe's herd when he'd stumbled onto this scene of attempted murder. Now, as he dragged himself and Annabelle up the muddy eastern bank, He could hear Hargrove's men crashing through the brush behind them, their curses fouling the air, worse than the stench of rotting cattle. The girl was barely conscious, her lips blue from cold and shock. A nasty gash on her temple leaked blood that the rain immediately washed away. She clutched something small and hard against her chest, something that glinted gold when lightning flashed. The Cheyenne camp. She gasped, her teeth chattering like castanets. Is it safe there? Greyhawk paused in his climb up the slippery bank. Most white children would rather face a pack of wolves than set foot in an Indian camp. But Annabelle Reed wasn't most children. He'd seen her around town, always alone, always watching, always treated like something distasteful by the other whites. Her stepfather's wealth couldn't buy her acceptance in a place where half-breed sympathizers were considered as dangerous as the Indians themselves. Safer than Crow's Ridge right now, he said, hefting her higher on his shoulder. But first tell me what you saw. What did you witness that made them want you dead? Her small body went rigid. I can't. They said they'd hurt Sarah. She's the only one who ever cared about me. Sarah Mitchell. Greyhawk knew the name, a widow woman who worked as a housemaid for the wealthy families in town. She had a reputation for kindness and discretion, two qualities that made her both valuable and vulnerable in a place like Crow's Ridge. The sound of breaking branches came closer. Hargrove's hunting party was gaining ground, despite the difficult terrain. Greyhawk's mind raced through options as he carried Annabelle toward the distant glow of his people's fires. The Cheyenne camp sat on a rise overlooking the river, its teepees arranged in the traditional circle with the medicine lodge at the center. Smoke rose from the fires despite the driving rain, and Greyhawk could see the silhouettes of warriors standing guard. They'd heard the gunshots. They'd be ready for trouble. As they approached the camp's perimeter, a familiar voice called out in Cheyenne. Greyhawk, what burden do you carry? It was Strong Bear, his war chief and oldest friend. A man who'd stood beside him through the darkest days after Moon Bear's death, who'd helped him carry the weight of leadership when grief threatened to crush him. A child who needs healing. Greyhawk replied in the same language. And white men with murder in their hearts pursuing us. Strong Bear's weathered face hardened. He was a man who'd counted coup against the Crow-fought cavalry soldiers and survived the massacre at Sand Creek. Violence was no stranger to him, but the murder of children, that was something else entirely. How many men? 4, armed with rifles, led by Blake Hargrove. A murmur went through the gathered warriors at that name. Hargrove's reputation for cruelty extended beyond the boundaries of Crow's Ridge. He'd cheated Indians out of their land, sold them diseased cattle, and turned a blind eye when his men took liberties with their women. But this was the first time he'd openly pursued someone into their camp. The girl is white. Strong Bear observed, not accusingly, but with the careful tone of a man thinking through consequences. She is a child, Greyhawk replied. And someone tried to murder her. That makes her our responsibility until the threat is ended. Annabelle stirred in his arms, her eyes fluttering open to take in the circle of Cheyenne faces around them. To her credit, she didn't scream or struggle. Instead, she looked directly at Strong Bear and said in a small but clear voice, "Thank you for helping us. I know you have no reason to trust white people." Strong Bear's fierce expression softened slightly. "Trust is earned through actions, little one. And Greyhawk's actions speak well of you." The sound of approaching horses cut through the conversation. Hargrove and his men had reached the river's edge and were shouting across the water, their words barely audible over the storm, but their hostile intent unmistakable. "They won't cross tonight," Strong Bear said, studying the swollen river. "But come morning, they'll find a way, or bring more men." Greyhawk nodded grimly. He carried Annabelle toward his own teepee, where his sister Yellowbird waited with healing herbs and warm blankets. As they walked, the girl's grip tightened on whatever she carried pressed against her chest. What is it you're hiding? Greyhawk asked gently. What's worth killing a child to keep secret? Annabelle looked up at him, her young face etched with a wisdom no 10-year-old should possess. I saw my stepfather kill a man, and I have proof. She opened her small fist to reveal a gold pocket watch, its surface engraved with the initials JM. Even in the dim firelight, Greyhawk could see dried blood on the chain. Jonas Miller, she whispered. He owned the land by Willow Creek. Blake wanted it for his cattle, but Mr. Miller wouldn't sell. So Blake, Her voice broke, and tears mixed with rainwater on her cheeks. Greyhawk felt a familiar rage building in his chest, the same fury that had consumed him when soldiers murdered his daughter in the name of progress and prosperity. But this time, he wouldn't let injustice win. This time, he'd find a way to protect the innocent and expose the truth, no matter what it cost him. As Yellowbird wrapped Annabelle in warm furs and began tending her wounds, Greyhawk stared across the flooded river at the lights of Crow's Ridge. Somewhere in that town, a murderer slept peacefully in his bed, while a child shivered with fear and cold. Not for long. 3 hours before dawn, the real storm began. Annabelle had been sleeping fitfully in Yellowbird's care when she suddenly bolted upright, her eyes wide with terror. "Sarah," she gasped. "They'll hurt Sarah." Greyhawk, who'd been keeping watch outside the teepee, ducked inside at her cry. The girl was trembling again, but not from cold this time. From pure, the animal fear. "Tell me what happened," he said, settling beside her with the careful movements of a man accustomed to dealing with frightened creatures. From the beginning. Annabelle clutched Jonas Miller's watch so tightly, her knuckles went white. "I wasn't supposed to be there. Blake sent me to stay with the Hendersons while he went to conduct business. But I forgot my book and snuck back to get it." The words came out in a rush, like water through a broken dam. "I heard voices in Blake's study, him and Mr. Miller, arguing about the Willow Creek property. Mr. Miller said he'd never sell, that his family was buried on that land. Blake got angry. Really angry." She paused, her breathing shallow and quick. Yellowbird pressed a cup of warm tea into her hands, speaking softly in Cheyenne. The girl took a sip and continued. "Blake pulled out his gun. Just like that. He said Mr. Miller could sell to him, or sell to the undertaker, made no difference to him. Mr. Miller tried to leave, but Blake shot him in the back. Right there in our house." Greyhawk's jaw tightened. He'd known Hargrove was ruthless, but cold-blooded murder in his own home spoke to a level of arrogance that went beyond mere greed. "How did you get the watch?" "When Blake went to get Morrison to help move the body, I snuck in and took it. I thought if I had proof, maybe Sheriff Collins would arrest him. But then Morrison saw me coming out of the study. That explained the panic in Hargrove's eyes when his men reported back. Annabelle hadn't just witnessed murder, she had physical evidence that could hang him. Sarah found me crying in my room later. I told her everything. She said we had to be smart about it, had to be careful. She was going to help me get to the territorial marshal in Buffalo, but then..." Annabelle's voice broke. "Morrison and Briggs came to the house tonight. They said Blake knew what I'd seen, what I'd taken. They said if I didn't give back the watch and promised to keep quiet, they'd hurt Sarah first, then me." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. When Annabelle refused to cooperate, Hargrove had ordered her elimination. The plan was simple: stage an accidental drowning. During the flood claim, the girl had been swept away while playing too close to the swollen river. No body to find, no questions to answer. Except Greyhawk had interfered with their perfect crime. "And where is Sarah now?" Greyhawk asked. "Still at the house as far as I know. Morrison said she'd be kept safe as long as she stayed quiet and pretended I'd just run off. But if I don't turn up dead..." Annabelle didn't need to finish the sentence. Sarah Mitchell was a loose end, and Blake Hargrove had just demonstrated exactly how he dealt with loose ends. Greyhawk stood and walked to the teepee's entrance, pushing aside the flap to peer across the river at Crow's Ridge. The town lay in darkness, except for a few scattered windows glowing like malevolent eyes. Somewhere in that maze of muddy streets and ramshackle buildings, an innocent woman was being held hostage by a murderer. And somewhere else, that same murderer was probably planning his next move. "I have to go back," Annabelle said from behind him. "I have to save Sarah." "No," Greyhawk said firmly. "You'll do nothing but get yourself killed and Sarah along with you. Hargrove has the advantage of home ground and armed men. Walking into his trap won't help anyone." "Then what do you suggest?" Annabelle's voice held a bitter note that was heartbreaking coming from a child. "Wait here while he murders the only person who ever cared about me." Greyhawk turned back to her, seeing again the fierce determination that reminded him so much of Moonbear. His daughter had possessed that same stubborn courage, that same refusal to back down when principle was at stake. "I suggest we be smarter than Hargrove expects us to be," he said. "You have evidence of his crime. That makes you powerful, not powerless. But evidence is only useful if it reaches the right hands." Annabelle wiped her nose with the back of her hand. "Sheriff Collins is in Blake's pocket. Everyone knows that. And the territorial marshal is 3 days' ride away." "Then we make our own justice," Greyhawk said. "But we do it carefully, and we do it right." Outside, the storm was beginning to subside, but Greyhawk could feel a different kind of tempest building. One that would either wash away the corruption choking Crow's Ridge or drown them all in the attempt. As he began to formulate a plan, one thought kept echoing in his mind. This time, he wouldn't let the innocent die while evil men prospered. This time, justice would prevail, no matter what the cost. But first, he had to keep Annabelle alive long enough to see the justice done. Dawn brought no relief, only clearer visibility of the nightmare they faced. Greyhawk stood at the edge of the camp, studying the river through Strong Bear's field glasses. The water had dropped several feet during the night, exposing muddy sandbars and fallen trees that would make crossing possible for determined men. And Blake Hargrove was nothing if not determined. 8 riders on the far bank. Strong Bear reported lowering his own spyglass. "They've been there since first light, but they're not making any move to cross yet." "They're waiting for something," Greyhawk said. "Or someone." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the water. A single rider was galloping hard toward Hargrove's position, kicking up great gouts of mud in his wake. Even at this distance, Greyhawk could see the glint of a badge on the man's chest. Sheriff Collins. So Hargrove was making this official. Greyhawk. Collins's voice carried clearly across the water, amplified by the morning stillness. "I know you can hear me send out the girl and there won't be any trouble." Behind Greyhawk, Annabelle emerged from Yellowbird's teepee, still pale but steady on her feet. She'd changed into dry clothes, a simple Cheyenne dress that made her look even younger and more vulnerable. "What's he saying?" she asked. "Nothing worth hearing," Greyhawk replied. But he cupped his hands around his mouth and called back, "What crime are you charging her with, Sheriff?" There was a long pause. Then Collins shouted, "Theft. She stole valuable property from her guardian. Mr. Hargrove just wants his belongings returned." Annabelle's hand instinctively went to the pocket where she'd hidden Jonas Miller's watch. "They're calling it theft now. They're calling it whatever they need to call it to get you back," Greyhawk said grimly. "Collins is either bought or fooled, but either way, he's doing Hargrove's work." Strong Bear moved up beside them, his hand resting on his rifle. "If they try to cross, we can hold them. The river's still dangerous, and we have the high ground." "For how long?" Greyhawk asked. "Today, tomorrow, eventually they'll bring the cavalry, and then we'll have bigger problems than one corrupt sheriff." The bitter truth was that the Cheyenne couldn't afford an open confrontation with white authorities, no matter how justified their actions. The government was always looking for excuses to break treaties and seize more land. A shootout over a white child would give them all the justification they needed. Annabelle seemed to understand this instinctively. "I should go back," she said quietly. "I shouldn't have brought this trouble to your people." "You didn't bring trouble," Greyhawk said. "Trouble was already here. You just shined a light on it." Yellowbird approached, carrying a small leather pouch. She spoke rapidly in Cheyenne, and Greyhawk nodded. "My sister has an idea," he told Annabelle. "There's an old mining trail that leads down to Willow Creek, about 2 miles south of town. If we could get you there with the watch, you could present your evidence directly to Judge Morrison when he arrives for the quarterly court session." Annabelle frowned. "But Bradley Morrison is working for Blake. He was there when they pushed me in the river." "Not Bradley Morrison, Judge Hiram Morrison, his father. The circuit judge who's been fighting corruption in the territory for 20 years. He's due in Crow's Ridge tomorrow, and he's one of the few officials that Hargrove can't buy or intimidate." For the first time since the ordeal began, hope flickered in Annabelle's eyes. "You think he'd listen to me?" "With physical evidence of murder, he'd have to. But getting you to him alive, that's the challenge." Across the river, Sheriff Collins was conferring with Hargrove and his men. Their gestures were becoming more animated, more urgent. Whatever patience they'd brought to this standoff was wearing thin. "If I created a distraction," Strong Bear suggested, "drew them north toward the old ford, you could slip south with the girl under cover of the timber." Greyhawk considered the plan. It was risky, but it might work. And it was certainly better than sitting here waiting for reinforcements to arrive. "What about Sarah?" Annabelle asked. "We can't just leave her." "First, we make sure you're safe," Greyhawk said. "Then we deal with Sarah. If Hargrove thinks you're dead or gone, he might let his guard down." It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was the best they had under the circumstances. Greyhawk began gathering his gear, checking his weapons, and preparing for what might be a very long day. As he worked, Annabelle watched him with the solemn attention of a child who understood that her life depended on the courage and skill of this scarred Cheyenne warrior. "Why are you helping me?" she asked suddenly. "You don't even know me." Greyhawk paused in his preparations, remembering another question from another child asked on another dark day years ago. Moonbear had wanted to know why the soldiers hated them so much, why they couldn't just live in peace. He'd never found a good answer for her. Maybe this was his chance to find one. "Because someone has to," he said simply. "And because the innocent deserve better than what this world usually gives them." Annabelle nodded, as if that made perfect sense to her. Which Greyhawk reflected it probably did. 10-year-olds had a clearer understanding of justice than most adults. Now, they just had to stay alive long enough to see that justice done. The plan went wrong from the very beginning. Strong Bear had barely begun his diversionary maneuver riding north with 6 warriors to draw Hargrove's attention when gunfire erupted from the south. Not the measured, controlled shooting of a planned engagement, but the rapid, desperate volleys of men fighting for their lives. Greyhawk grabbed his rifle and sprinted toward the sound, Annabelle close behind him, despite his shouted orders for her to stay hidden. Through the trees, he could see smoke rising from the direction of the old mine trail, the very route they'd planned to use for their escape. "It's a trap," Annabelle gasped, struggling to keep up with his longer strides. They knew. Somehow they knew. Greyhawk's mind raced through the implications. If Hargrove had anticipated their escape route, it meant he had information about Cheyenne movements and plans. It meant there was either a spy in the camp or the ugly truth hit him like a physical blow. Sheriff Collins hadn't come to negotiate. He'd come to force a confrontation that would justify bringing in federal troops. The whole standoff had been orchestrated to provoke exactly this kind of violent response. They reached the edge of the timber just as the shooting intensified. Below them, in a small clearing near the creek, 2 Cheyenne warriors were pinned down behind fallen logs, while a dozen white men poured fire at them from 3 different directions. It was a slaughter in the making. Running Wolf and Tall Bear. Greyhawk muttered, recognizing the trapped warriors. They were scouting the trail for us. One of the warriors' running wolf was clutching his shoulder blood, seeping between his fingers. His rifle lay shattered beside him, its stock splintered by a lucky shot. Tall Bear was still returning fire, but his ammunition wouldn't last much longer against those odds. Annabelle tugged at Greyhawk's sleeve. "Can we help them?" Greyhawk studied the situation with the cold calculation of a man who'd survived more battles than he cared to count. The white men had positioned themselves well, using the natural terrain to create overlapping fields of fire. A frontal assault would be suicide, and flanking maneuvers would take too long. Unless, "Stay here," he ordered Annabelle. "No matter what happens, do not show yourself until I come back for you." "Where are you going?" "To even the odds." Greyhawk worked his way through the timber, using every lesson learned in 30 years of warfare to approach the ambush site undetected. The white men were so focused on their trapped prey that they'd grown careless about watching their flanks. He recognized most of the shooters. Bradley Morrison was there, of course, along with Tom Briggs and Jack Corwin. But there were others too, men he didn't know, hard cases with the look of hired guns about them. Hargrove had brought in professional killers to finish this business. Greyhawk settled behind a thick pine tree and took careful aim at Morrison, who was shouting orders to the other men. The shot would alert them to his presence, but it might also create enough confusion for the trapped warriors to break free. He was squeezing the trigger when a cold voice spoke behind him. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Chief." Greyhawk froze. Slowly, he turned his head to see Sheriff Collins standing 10 feet away, his revolver aimed squarely at Greyhawk's spine. The lawman's face was grim, but determined, like a man doing distasteful but necessary work. "Drop the rifle," Collins said. "Nice and easy." Greyhawk let the weapon fall. "How long have you been Hargrove's dog, Sheriff?" Collins's jaw tightened. "I'm nobody's dog. But I know what's best for this territory, and it ain't having every ranch war turn into an Indian uprising. You savages need to learn your place. And what place is that watching children get murdered for profit? The girl's a liar and a thief. Hargrove's been more than patient with her, but she's pushed him too far. Now she's going to face justice." Greyhawk almost laughed at the bitter irony. Collins genuinely believed he was upholding the law even as he helped cover up cold-blooded murder. The corruption in Crow's Ridge ran so deep that even the sheriff couldn't see it anymore. "Where is she?" Collins demanded. "Where's the girl?" Greyhawk said nothing. In the clearing below, the gunfire was slackening as the trapped warriors ran low on ammunition. Soon they'd be overrun, and Hargrove would have 2 more deaths to lay at the Cheyenne's feet. Collins cocked his revolver. "I asked you a question, Chief, and I chose not to answer it." For a long moment, the 2 men stared at each other across the divide of culture law and moral certainty. Then Collins raised his gun to fire, and Greyhawk knew he was about to die for a child he'd known less than a day. The shot that killed Sheriff Collins came from behind Greyhawk, the bullet taking the lawman squarely in the chest and spinning him around like a child's top. He hit the ground hard and lay still, his blood soaking into the pine needles. Greyhawk spun to see Annabelle standing 20 yards away, with Collins' fallen rifle smoking in her small hands. Her face was white as bone, her eyes wide with shock at what she'd just done. "I told you to stay hidden," Greyhawk said, but there was no anger in his voice. Only amazement at the courage it must have taken for a 10-year-old girl to shoot a grown man, even to save a life. "He was going to kill you," she said simply. "I couldn't let that happen." The gunfire in the clearing below had stopped completely. Either the warriors were dead, or the shooting of Collins had created enough distraction for them to escape. Greyhawk hoped it was the latter, but he couldn't take time to find out. Voices were calling through the trees, now men responding to the unexpected gunshot. Hargrove's killers would be here soon, and when they found Collins' body, all pretense of legal authority would vanish. It would become what it had always really been, a hunt to the death. "We have to go," Greyhawk said, retrieving his rifle. "Right now." Annabelle nodded, but she was staring down at Colin's corpse, with the haunted expression of someone who just crossed a line they could never uncross. "Will I go to hell for killing him?" she asked. Greyhawk knelt beside her, meeting her eyes with the steady gaze of a man who'd killed in defense of others and somehow found peace with it. "If there's justice in the next world," he said, "it's Sheriff Collins who'll have to answer for his choices, not you." Then he took her hand, and together they ran deeper into the forest, leaving behind the growing sounds of pursuit and the body of a man who'd chosen the wrong side of history. The revelation came like lightning, splitting a dark sky, sudden and blinding in its clarity. They'd been running for 3 hours through the dense timber, following game trails that Greyhawk knew by heart, when Annabelle suddenly stumbled and fell. Not from exhaustion, though she was clearly spent, but from the shock of understanding something that had been nagging at her subconscious. "The badge," she gasped, sitting hard on a fallen log. "I saw Colin's badge when I shot him." Greyhawk knelt beside her, offering water from his canteen. "What about it?" It was silver, old and tarnished with a crack down the middle. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I've seen that badge before." Something cold crawled up Greyhawk's spine. "Where?" "In Blake's study, on his desk. He keeps it there like a trophy." Annabelle's hands were shaking again. "Greyhawk, I don't think Collins was working for Blake. I think Blake was Collins." The words hit Greyhawk like a physical blow. For a moment, the forest seemed to spin around him as the implications crashed through his mind like dominoes falling. Blake Hargrove and Sheriff Collins were the same person. It explained everything, how Collins always seemed to know exactly what Hargrove was planning, how the sheriff consistently arrived just in time to provide legal cover for the rancher's crimes, how law enforcement in Crow's Ridge had become so completely corrupted. There was no Sheriff Collins. There never had been. Just Blake Hargrove playing 2 roles, manipulating both sides of the law to build his empire of fear and greed. "The man I just killed." Annabelle's voice was hollow with horror. "Was the same man who murdered Jonas Miller." Greyhawk finished. "The same man who tried to have you drowned. You didn't kill an innocent lawman, Annabelle. You killed the monster who's been terrorizing this territory for years." But even as he spoke the words of comfort, Greyhawk's mind was racing ahead to the larger problem. If Hargrove was dead, who were the men still hunting them? Bradley Morrison was Hargrove's foreman, but he didn't have the authority to command federal troops or continue this charade of legal pursuit. Unless the sound of approaching horses cut through his thoughts. Multiple riders moving fast through the timber, following their trail with the skill of experienced trackers. Too skilled for Morrison's usual collection of hired thugs. Greyhawk pulled Annabelle behind a cluster of boulders just as the first rider came into view. The man wore the blue uniform of the U.S. Cavalry, his brass buttons gleaming in the filtered sunlight. Behind him rode a full squad of soldiers, their carbines ready for action. Leading them was a man Greyhawk recognized with a chill of recognition, Colonel Marcus Thorne, the officer who'd commanded the troops during the massacre at Willow Creek 8 years ago. The man whose soldiers had killed Moonbear. Thorne called a halt 20 yards from their hiding place, his pale eyes scanning the forest with the predatory focus of a born killer. When he spoke, his voice carried the same cold authority that Greyhawk remembered from that terrible day. "I know you're out there, Greyhawk," Thorne called. "There's no point in running. We've got tracking dogs coming up behind us, and the whole territory's been alerted to your escape." Greyhawk's blood turned to ice. This wasn't about Annabelle anymore, if it ever really had been. This was about him, about settling an old score that had been festering for 8 years. "You killed Sheriff Collins." Thorne continued, his voice carrying clearly through the forest. "Shot him down in cold blood while he was trying to negotiate a peaceful resolution. That makes you a cop killer, Chief. And we all know what happens to cop killers. Beside him, Annabelle started to rise, probably to shout the truth about what had really happened. Greyhawk's hand clamped down on her shoulder, holding her in place. "They won't believe you," he whispered. "And even if they did, it wouldn't matter. This isn't about justice anymore." "Then what is it about?" Greyhawk studied Thorn's face through the gaps in the rocks, seeing the same cruel satisfaction he'd worn while watching Cheyenne children die. "Revenge," he said simply. "He's been waiting 8 years for an excuse to finish what he started at Willow Creek." The truth was even worse than he'd imagined. Hargrove's business relationship with the sheriff hadn't been corruption, it had been coordination. Thorn and Hargrove had been partners using military authority and civilian law enforcement to control the territory between them. When Greyhawk had interfered with their plans for Annabelle, he'd given Thorn the perfect excuse to eliminate the last major obstacle to their complete domination of the region. And now Hargrove was dead, which meant Thorn had to clean up the mess personally. "Send out the girl," Thorn called, "and I might consider letting you live long enough to stand trial." The lie was so transparent, it was almost insulting. Thorn had no intention of taking prisoners. This was a hunting party, not an arrest detail. Greyhawk checked his rifle, counting the cartridges remaining. Enough for maybe 6 shots if he made them count. Against a full squad of cavalry, it might as well have been empty. But then Annabelle pressed something into his hand. Jonas Miller's pocket watch, its gold surface warm from her body heat. "Whatever happens to us," she whispered, "someone has to know the truth. Someone has to remember what really happened here." Greyhawk looked down at the watch and then at the brave little girl beside him. In her eyes, he saw the same fierce determination to bear witness that had driven his people for generations. The same refusal to let evil triumph without a fight. And suddenly he knew exactly what he had to do. The plan that formed in Greyhawk's mind was desperate, dangerous, and probably impossible. But it was also the only chance they had. "Listen to me carefully," he whispered to Annabelle. "In about 2 minutes, I'm going to create the biggest distraction I can manage. When I do, you run. Not back toward the camp, but south toward Willow Creek. Follow the water downstream until you reach the old mining camp. What about you? I'll catch up when I can. But if I don't, you keep going until you reach Fort McKinney. Find Judge Morrison. He should be there for the quarterly territorial court. Give him the watch and tell him everything." Annabelle's lower lip trembled, but her voice was steady. "You're not coming back, are you?" Greyhawk met her eyes, seeing again the terrible wisdom that tragedy had forced upon her. "Maybe not, but you will. And you'll make sure the truth survives, even if we don't." Before Annabelle could argue, Greyhawk rose from behind the rocks and stepped into the open, his rifle held high in a gesture of surrender. The soldiers immediately swung their weapons toward him, but Thorn raised a hand to hold their fire. "Colonel Thorn." Greyhawk called out, his voice carrying across the clearing. "I remember you." Thorn's smile was cold as winter wind. "And I remember you, Chief. Still playing protector to white children, I see. How did that work out for your daughter?" The words hit their target with surgical precision, just as they were meant to. But instead of the rage Thorn expected, Greyhawk felt only a strange, cold clarity descending over him. "She died with honor," Greyhawk said. "Defending the innocent against men like you, just as I'm going to do." Noble words from a child killer. Thorn sneered. "But we both know what you really are. A savage who needs to be put down like the rabid animal you've become." Greyhawk began walking slowly toward the soldiers, his rifle still raised, but not quite aimed at anyone in particular. Behind him, he could hear Annabelle moving through the brush, working her way toward the creek. "You know what I find interesting, Colonel?" Greyhawk said conversationally. "How quickly Sheriff Collins was able to summon federal troops, almost like he knew you were already on your way." Something flickered in Thorn's eyes. Not guilt, the man was beyond such emotions, but calculation. He was wondering how much Greyhawk knew how much damage the truth could do to his carefully constructed narrative. Collins was a patriot, Thorne said. He understood the need for strong leadership in these troubled times. Strong leadership. Is that what you call murdering ranchers for their land? Is that what you called shooting children at Willow Creek? Now Greyhawk was close enough to see the faces of the individual soldiers. Some looked uncomfortable with this conversation, uncertain about their role in whatever was happening here. Others seemed eager for blood, their fingers caressing their triggers. But all of them were focused on him, which meant none of them were watching for a small girl slipping away through the timber. Enough talk. Thorne set his hand, dropping to his sidearm. You're under arrest for the murder of Sheriff Collins. Drop your weapon and surrender, or... Greyhawk never let him finish the sentence. In one fluid motion, he dropped to one knee and brought his rifle to bear on the colonel's chest. The shot echoed through the forest like thunder, and Thorne spun backward off his horse blood, blossoming across his blue uniform. The clearing exploded into chaos as the soldiers opened fire, their carbines crackling like firecrackers. Greyhawk rolled behind a fallen tree as bullets whined overhead, already working the lever of his rifle for a second shot. But as he raised his head to aim, he realized that not all the soldiers were shooting at him. 3 of them had turned their weapons on their own comrades, cutting down the men beside them with methodical precision. It took Greyhawk a moment to understand what he was seeing. These weren't all federal troops. Some of them were Hargrove's men dressed in stolen uniforms and playing the part of cavalry soldiers. With Thorne dead, their deception was unraveling, and they were eliminating the real soldiers to prevent them from carrying word back to Fort McKinney. The firefight was savage, but brief. When the smoke cleared, 7 men lay dead in the mud, and 3 others were backing away toward their horses, their faces grim with the knowledge that their plan had gone catastrophically wrong. Bradley Morrison was one of the survivors, his stolen uniform torn and bloody. When he saw Greyhawk rising from behind the log, his face twisted with rage. "You son of a bitch," Morrison snarled, fumbling to reload his carbine. "You've ruined everything, years of work all destroyed because you couldn't mind your own business." Greyhawk's second shot took Morrison's center mass, folding him over like a broken hinge. The man fell without another word, his blood mixing with that of the soldiers he'd betrayed. The remaining 2 men, Greyhawk recognized them as Tom Briggs, and another hired gun decided that discretion was the better part of valor. They mounted their horses and fled north, probably hoping to reach the border, before word of this disaster spread. Greyhawk let them go. He had more important concerns than chasing down every last criminal in Hargrove's organization. In the sudden silence that followed the gunfight, he could hear the sound of running water from Willow Creek. Somewhere downstream, a 10-year-old girl was carrying the truth toward justice, protected by the sacrifice of good men and the failure of evil ones. Greyhawk began the long walk after her, hoping he'd live long enough to see her safely delivered to those who would believe her story and act upon it. Behind him, the bodies of Colonel Thorne and his conspirators lay sprawled in the mud, their schemes ended forever. It wasn't the justice Greyhawk had originally envisioned, but it was justice nonetheless. And sometimes justice came at the end of a rifle, rather than from a courtroom. The abandoned mining camp at Willow Creek sat like a collection of broken bones scattered across the valley floor. Empty cabins leaned against each other for support, their windows dark and glassless. Rusted equipment lay half-buried in the weeds, and the old sluice boxes had become gardens for wildflowers and sage. Greyhawk found Annabelle huddled in the remains of what had once been the camp's general store, her small form barely visible in the shadows. She looked up as he entered, relief flooding her face. "I thought they'd killed you," she whispered. Harder to kill than they expected." Greyhawk replied, settling beside her with a grunt of exhaustion. The afternoon's violence had taken its toll, and he could feel every one of his 44 years in his aching bones. "Are they still following us?" "Not anymore." Greyhawk didn't elaborate, and Annabelle didn't ask. Some burdens were too heavy for children to carry, even children who'd already seen too much. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the creek babble over its rocky bed. In the distance, Greyhawk could see smoke rising from Crow's Ridge black columns against the evening sky. Word of the day's events was spreading, and he wondered what version of the truth would eventually emerge from the chaos. Greyhawk, Annabelle's voice was small in the gathering darkness. What happens now? It was a fair question, and one he'd been pondering himself. With Hargrove dead and his organization scattered, the immediate threat to Annabelle's life was over. But that didn't solve the larger problem of what to do with a 10-year-old witness to murder in a territory where law and justice were often strangers. "Now we get you to Judge Morrison," Greyhawk said. "Let him hear your story and decide what comes next." And then, Greyhawk looked down at her, seeing the uncertainty in her eyes. Annabelle Reed was an orphan now, even if she didn't fully understand it yet. With Hargrove dead, she had no guardian, no family, no place in the white world that had never really accepted her anyway. "Then we figure out where you belong," he said carefully. "I don't belong anywhere," Annabelle said with a matter-of-fact sadness that only children could muster. "Blake never wanted me. The other families in town think I'm cursed. And now that Sarah's—" Her voice broke, and Greyhawk felt his heart constrict. In all the chaos of the day, he'd almost forgotten about Sarah Mitchell, and the one person who'd shown Annabelle genuine kindness in a world full of cruelty. "We don't know what's happened to Sarah," he said gently. "She might be safe. She might have escaped when word spread about Hargrove's death." But even as he spoke the words, Greyhawk knew they were probably false comfort. Men like Morrison and Briggs didn't leave loose ends alive. And Sarah Mitchell had been the loosest end of all. Annabelle seemed to sense his doubts. "She's dead, isn't she? They killed her to keep her quiet." Greyhawk wanted to lie to offer false hope in place of harsh reality. But this child had already endured too much deception from the adults in her life. She deserved the truth, however painful it might be. "Probably," he said quietly. "I'm sorry." Annabelle nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks, but her voice steady. "She died because she tried to help me. Because she was the only one who cared enough to try. She died because she was a good person in a world that punishes goodness," Greyhawk corrected. "But that doesn't make goodness wrong. It makes the world wrong." They sat quietly for a while, mourning a woman who died for the crime of showing kindness to a lonely child. Outside, the shadows were growing longer, and Greyhawk knew they'd need to move soon if they were going to reach Fort McKinney before Judge Morrison departed for his next circuit stop. But first, there was something else that needed to be said. Annabelle. Greyhawk began choosing his words carefully. "When all this is over, when you've told your story to the judge and justice has been done, you'll need somewhere to go. Somewhere safe." "An orphanage, you mean?" Her voice was flat resigned. "Or with my people, with the Cheyenne." Annabelle looked up at him in surprise. "You mean live with you, if you wanted to?" "It wouldn't be easy. You'd have to learn our ways, our language. And some of my people might not accept you at first. But you'd be safe, and you'd be wanted." The offer surprised Greyhawk almost as much as it seemed to surprise Annabelle. He hadn't planned to make it, hadn't even consciously considered the possibility until the words left his mouth. But now that they were spoken, he realized how right they felt. This brave little girl reminded him so much of Moon Bear, not just in her courage, but in her sense of justice, her refusal to accept the world's cruelties as inevitable. Taking her in wouldn't bring his daughter back, but it might give him a chance to honor Moon Bear's memory by protecting another innocent child from a world that seemed determined to destroy such spirits. Annabelle was quiet for a long time, staring out at the creek where the last light of day was fading into purple dusk. "Would I have to change my name?" she finally asked. "You could keep Annabelle if you wanted, or choose a Cheyenne name that felt right to you. And I could visit Sarah's grave sometimes to remember her." Greyhawk's throat tightened. As often as you wanted. Annabelle nodded slowly, as if making some internal calculation that only she could understand. I'd like that, she said finally. I'd like to belong somewhere, to be wanted by someone. And in that moment, Greyhawk felt something he hadn't experienced in 8 long years' hope. Not just for Annabelle's future, but for his own. For the possibility that loss and grief didn't have to be the end of the story, that sometimes second chances came disguised as unexpected responsibilities. He stood and extended his hand to her. Come on, daughter. Let's go see about that justice you're carrying. Annabelle took his hand without hesitation, and together they walked out into the Wyoming night, heading toward whatever tomorrow might bring. Judge Hiram Morrison proved to be everything his reputation promised, and nothing like his son. Where Bradley had been cruel and weak, Hiram was stern but fair. Where the younger Morrison had sold his integrity for Hargrove's gold, the judge had spent 30 years building a reputation for incorruptible justice that extended from Denver to the Canadian border. He listened to Annabelle's story with the focused attention of a man accustomed to weighing testimony, asking pointed questions, but never making her feel like she was on trial. When she finished, he examined Jonas Miller's pocket watch with the thoroughness of an experienced investigator. The blood on this chain will need to be verified, he said finally, but the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming. Combined with your testimony, Miss Reed, I believe we have sufficient grounds for a full investigation into Blake Hargrove's activities. But he's dead, Annabelle pointed out. What good does an investigation do now? Judge Morrison smiled grimly. Justice isn't just about punishing the guilty child. It's about setting the record straight, clearing the names of the innocent, and making sure such crimes don't happen again. They were sitting in the judge's temporary chambers at Fort McKinney, a Spartan room that reflected its occupants' no-nonsense approach to law and order. Greyhawk stood near the window, watching the parade ground, where soldiers went about their morning duties in orderly formations. There's also the matter of Colonel Thorne's involvement. Judge Morrison continued glancing at Greyhawk. If what you've told me is true, we're looking at a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of military command in this territory. It's true, Greyhawk said without turning from the window. Thorne and Hargrove were partners. They used military force and civilian law enforcement to terrorize anyone who stood in their way. That's a serious accusation to make against a federal officer. It's a serious crime to commit against innocent people. Judge Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying Greyhawk's profile. You killed him. It wasn't a question, and Greyhawk didn't treat it like one. Yes, in self-defense, according to Miss Reed's account. According to the facts, the judge was quiet for a long moment, weighing evidence and precedent in the scales of his considerable experience. Finally, he reached a decision that surprised no one who knew his reputation. Given the circumstances, he said, and given Colonel Thorne's apparent abuse of military authority, I see no grounds for charges against you, Chief Greyhawk. If anything, you did this territory a service by stopping a dangerous criminal. Annabelle sagged with relief, but Greyhawk remained tense. In his experience, white justice was rarely so straightforward, especially when it involved dead soldiers and living Indians. However, Judge Morrison continued, there will need to be a formal inquiry. Statements will be taken, evidence will be examined, and a complete report will be filed with the territorial governor. The truth will come out, but it may take time. How much time? Greyhawk asked. Months, possibly. The machinery of justice moves slowly, especially when it involves corruption at high levels. But it does move, I assure you. Greyhawk nodded, accepting the reality of bureaucratic processes, even if he didn't like them. At least Annabelle would be safe during the investigation Judge Morrison had already arranged for her temporary care with a family in Denver who specialized in taking in children who'd witnessed traumatic events. But Annabelle had other ideas. I want to stay with Greyhawk, she said firmly. He saved my life. He's the only family I have left. Judge Morrison raised an eyebrow. That's unusual, Miss Reed. Are you certain that's what you want? I'm certain. The judge looked at Greyhawk. And you're willing to take responsibility for her welfare? I am. It won't be easy. A white child living among the Cheyenne will face challenges from both communities. And if this investigation drags on, there may be people who see her as a liability. Greyhawk finally turned from the window, his dark eyes meeting the judge's pale blue ones. Then they'll have to go through me to reach her. Something in his tone made Judge Morrison smile slightly. I believe they will find that difficult. The paperwork took another hour to complete. But by noon, Greyhawk found himself walking out of Fort McKinney with legal guardianship of Annabelle Reed. It wasn't adoption that would require more time and different procedures, but it was enough to keep her safe and give her a place to belong, while the wheels of justice ground through their deliberations. As they reached the horses, Judge Morrison had provided for their journey back to the Cheyenne camp. Annabelle paused. Greyhawk, can we stop by the cemetery in Crow's Ridge? I want to say goodbye to Sarah. Greyhawk's heart clenched at the quiet pain in her voice. Of course. They rode south through the afternoon, taking their time and avoiding the main roads where curious eyes might spot them. By evening, they could see the lights of Crow's Ridge in the distance, a town that looked deceptively peaceful in the gathering dusk. The cemetery sat on a hill overlooking the settlement, its weathered headstones casting long shadows in the fading light. They found Sarah Mitchell's grave, easily enough a simple wooden cross marking a fresh mound of earth. Someone had already placed wildflowers there. Probably other townspeople who'd known and respected the kind woman who died for doing the right thing. Annabelle knelt beside the grave, her small hands placing a single white lily she'd picked along the trail. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm sorry you died because of me. But I promise I won't let them forget what you did. I won't let them forget that you were the only one who cared. Greyhawk stood quietly behind her, keeping watch on the approaches to the cemetery, while she said her goodbyes. In the distance, he could see lights moving through the streets of Crow's Ridge, as people went about their evening business, probably already weaving new stories to explain the recent violence in terms they could understand and accept. But here beside this simple grave, the truth was clear and uncomplicated. A good woman had died protecting a child, and that sacrifice would not be forgotten. When Annabelle finally stood, her cheeks were wet with tears, but her expression was resolute. I'm ready to go home now, she said. And as they rode away from Crow's Ridge toward the distant glow of Cheyenne fires, Greyhawk realized that for the first time in 8 years, he truly understood what home meant. 5 years later, the memorial stood beside the Powder River like a silent sentinel against forgetting. Carved from a single block of Wyoming granite, it bore the simple inscription, "In memory of Sarah Mitchell and Jonas Miller, killed for defending the innocent. Their courage lives on in those they died protecting." Greyhawk stood before the monument with his adopted daughter, now 15 years old, and carrying herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd found her place in the world. Annabelle had grown tall and strong during her years with the Cheyenne, her honey-colored hair now braided in the traditional style and decorated with eagle feathers earned through acts of courage and wisdom. She had chosen a Cheyenne name for herself 3 years ago, Truth Keeper. It suited her. Do you think they would approve? She asked, studying the memorial's inscription. Sarah and Mr. Miller, I mean. Do you think they'd like being remembered this way? Greyhawk considered the question, with the thoughtfulness that 5 years of fatherhood had taught him. I think they'd be proud that their deaths led to something better, that the corruption they died fighting was finally rooted out, and it had been eventually. Judge Morrison's investigation had uncovered a web of crime and conspiracy that reached from Crow's Ridge to the territorial capital. Dozens of officials had been removed from office, including several military officers who'd been complicit in Thorne's schemes. The governor himself had been forced to resign, when evidence surfaced linking him to land fraud. More importantly, reforms had been implemented to prevent such corruption from taking root again. A new territorial marshal's office had been established with broader authority to investigate crimes across jurisdictional boundaries. Military commanders were now required to report to civilian oversight boards. And victims of official misconduct had new legal recourses that hadn't existed before. It wasn't perfect, no system ever was, but it was better, measurably, demonstrably better. Father Truthkeeper used the Cheyenne word, as she always did now. "There's something I need to tell you." Greyhawk looked at her, noting the serious expression that meant she'd been wrestling with something important. "What is it?" "I've been thinking about my future, about what I want to do with my life." Greyhawk nodded encouragingly. At 15, Truthkeeper was already showing signs of the intelligence and determination that would shape her adult life. He'd been wondering what path she would choose. "I want to study law," she said. "I want to become a lawyer so I can help people who don't have anyone to speak for them, like Sarah tried to speak for me." The announcement didn't surprise Greyhawk as much as it might have once. Truthkeeper had always been drawn to questions of justice and fairness, always the first to stand up for those who couldn't defend themselves. In another world, she might have become a warrior. In this one, she would fight with words and laws instead of weapons. "It won't be easy," he warned. "There aren't many women lawyers, and even fewer who've lived among the Cheyenne. You'll face prejudice from both worlds." "I know. But someone has to be first, don't they? Someone has to break down the barriers so others can follow." Greyhawk smiled, hearing in her words the echo of the brave little girl who'd shot a corrupt sheriff to save a life. "Judge Morrison would sponsor your legal education. He's mentioned it before. You'd let me go, leave the people, leave you." The question pierced Greyhawk's heart, but he answered without hesitation. "I'd let you become who you're meant to be. That's what fathers do. They raise their children to fly, not to stay caged." Truthkeeper stepped closer and took his hand, a gesture that reminded him poignantly of their first meeting beside the flooded river. "I won't forget where I come from. I won't forget the people who raised me or the ones who died to save me. I know you won't. And when you're ready, you'll come back and help our people navigate this changing world. We're going to need advocates who understand both sides of the divide." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the river flow past the memorial toward its distant meeting with the sea. Greyhawk thought about the circular nature of things, how endings led to beginnings, how loss could become purpose, how a child saved from drowning could grow up to save others in turn. In the distance, smoke rose from the Cheyenne camp, where Strong Bear was probably telling stories to the young warriors, passing down the old wisdom while adapting to new realities. The world was changing. There was no stopping that. But perhaps it was changing in ways that would honor the memory of those who'd fought and died for justice. "Now come on," Greyhawk said finally. "Yellowbird is expecting us for dinner, and you know how she gets when we're late." As they walked back toward their horses, Truthkeeper paused one more time to look at the memorial. "Do you think the truth always wins in the end?" she asked. Greyhawk considered the question with the gravity it deserved. "Not always, but it wins often enough to make the fight worthwhile. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, it wins, because brave people refuse to let it be buried." Truthkeeper nodded, satisfied with that answer. Then she swung onto her horse with the easy grace of someone equally at home in the saddle or the courtroom she would someday grace. As they rode toward home, Greyhawk felt a deep sense of completion settling over him. The circle that had begun with tragedy at Willow Creek had closed with hope beside the Powder River. Moonbear's death had not been meaningless. It had led him to save another child, to raise her with love and purpose, and to see her grow into someone who would make the world a little more just. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was a good life, a life with meaning, and in the end, that was all any man could ask for. Behind them, the memorial stood silent guard over the flowing river, its granite surface already beginning to weather and age in the way of all human monuments. But the truth it commemorated would endure longer than stone carried forward in the hearts and minds of those who refused to forget the price of justice. In Crow's Ridge, people still spoke of the flood year when everything changed. They told different versions of the story as people do, but they all agreed on the essential truth. Sometimes a single act of courage can wash away decades of corruption, and sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected sources. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, a child pushed into dark water doesn't drown. She learns to swim upstream against the current of injustice, carrying light into the deepest shadows of the world. The truth, like water, always finds a way to flow toward its proper destination. And those who help it along the way become part of something larger than themselves, part of the great current of human progress that carries us all toward whatever justice awaits on the far shore of tomorrow.